but certain properties that we say is a decent model for certain aspects of clouds. Okay. So next, please. So at the onset, I would like to dedicate this give a dedication to Professor Rodam Narasimha, because it was under him that I really could get introduced to this work. And of course, he is Padma Vibhushan Fellow of Royal Society, and probably I'm not wrong in saying he is the tallest figure of India's fluid dynamics community. Okay. So next. So as I said, we seek to simulate a flow that mimics the flow physics of clouds. Now, clouds, why are they important? They have been listed by IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as one of the most important, problems requiring attention for climate prediction, because we have models that they say that so much of global warming is going to occur, so much of this, and clouds is a very, very important aspect of it, because it has such a big impact on the energy balance on the Earth's atmosphere as well as the oceans. Because at any time people say that 60 to 70% of the Earth is covered by clouds, not necessarily always that we can see them at all levels, not necessarily thunder clouds. Clouds occur at even at maybe 20-30 kilometers high. So there are clouds everywhere, almost everywhere. And just as an example, there is this person, Shreya Mayer. He, in 2015, he wrote an article in Nature asking scientists to please start analyzing the behavior of clouds, because that is one of the aspect that is not modeled that well in the models that govern that tell future predictions of climate as well as weather. Next, please. So basically, cloud, we all know what a cloud is. A cloud is a mass of liquid or solid water. So water, many times we think it's just liquid, but it's a liquid or solid. Solid means ice, and it's suspended in the atmosphere. Next. Now, when do we see this cloud? So, moment the sun, sun falls on, let's say, a patch of water, for example, and it evaporates, and certain amount of the vapor comes, doesn't mean we can see it. Once it condenses in the sky for whatever reason, we can see it. Then we can say that we can see the cloud because it condenses, and we can see it because the sun's rays, one is reflected, another one is highly absorbed by the condensed water vapor. Next. So clouds are of course transient phenomena. They don't last for a long time, few hours. That's why they are called transient phenomena. So it's a very unsteady problem. Next. So how do clouds impact the weather and climate? So basically, clouds convert solar radiation into latent heat. Why does it do that? Because as I just explained, that the sun rays will come and they will hit the water, or it hits the plants which are doing transpiration, and then the water vapor will it will convert from the liquid form to the vapor form. That means latent heat is being taken, and this latent heat, once it rises up a certain height, if it gets condensed, it is released into the atmosphere. So they have a significant role in transporting heat across the whole extent of the atmosphere, because it is like clouds are basically like a huge engine for the Earth's atmosphere. They cool as well as heat. Cooling is, we know that sometimes when thick clouds come, they sometimes cool. Why do they cool? Because they reflect some of the sun's incoming radiation out. And why do they heat? Because after some amount of the sun's radiation would come in through the clouds, and that would hit the Earth's surface. The Earth's surface will get heated. This will go up. It will be that Earth's surface will get heated, and it will obviously emit some radiation. It emits in the infrared. This infrared radiation would go up, and what happens is that water vapor in the clouds, that will also absorb the infrared radiation, because H2O is actually a greenhouse gas. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. H2O vapor is a greenhouse gas, not water by itself. So it goes and it nicely traps. So that can also heat the Earth's atmosphere. Next. And of course, this atmospheric pollutants change the behavior of clouds. For example, we have heard of cloud seeding, where they actually put, for vapor to condense, it will not condense so easily until you have a nucleation site, a small particle or something for it to condense. So what do people do in cloud seeding? One of the methods is, you put a large number of nuclear particles like salt, which are hydrophilic. So the water vapor will like those salt particles and like to condense on it. Okay, so that artificial pollutants can change the behavior of clouds. Atmospheric pollutants, artificial or natural, because for example, seas, the bottom level of the seas are full of these salts. Okay, next. So it's very important for us to be able to simulate moist convection patterns, that is moisture, moisture driven convection. As I said, that clouds absorb this latent heat, and not clouds absorb this latent heat of the water is converted to, water is converted to vapor, and that is redistributed. So it's a entire cycle of, transporting heat from one location to another location, and it's very important for the Indian monsoon. That is nothing, I don't hardly need to explain it, why clouds are important for the Indian monsoon. Next. And in the case, particularly, there is something called a cumulus cloud. And because cumulus clouds are usually rain-bearing clouds. For example, thunderstorms, which, those clouds can extend from 1 or 2 kilometers above us up to almost 10 kilometers or 11 kilometers. Those are cumulus towers. Okay, those are very important. So cumulus clouds are the rain-bearing cloud, which is very important for us. Next. So as I said, that we try to simulate a flow that mimics the physics of clouds. So what does it mean? So with this picture, basically I want to just tell that the first amongst the first experiments on how to simulate clouds in the laboratory was done by Professor Narasimha and his group, and that was summarized. Of course, it done for a long time. Finally, it was summarized in 2014, where Professor Narasimha was a co-author. So you can see in this figure, on the left side are the blue and white, those are real clouds. On the right side is what is done in the laboratory. So you can see that the shapes, the red ones and the on the right, and on the left the blue ones, they are similar. So basically what it has been shown that it is possible through some way to simulate cloud shapes in the laboratory itself. So if it is being simulated, if it is experimentally we are able to do it properly in the laboratory, that means something has been captured correctly. At least a gross physical reasons why certain cloud shapes come, that has been captured. And how does it do? You can see in wherever the red color, the red shapes are there are certain horizontal lines. Now in the experiment, what has happened is that they have made that region conduct electricity in between any two of the horizontal lines. So when you are able to conduct electricity, that is, the fluid is such that this electricity is converted to heating, I square R kind of thing. And so what is happening? What is the cloud? Basically a cloud, it forms, as I said, when the water vapor condenses. Condensation of water vapor releases latent heat. So it's as good as saying that heating is a very important aspect for understanding cloud behavior. And that was recognized very clearly by Professor Narasimha. So with this experiments, what he tried to do, he tried to change the heating of a fluid. So suppose you have a certain amount of fluid. Is there any trouble? I hope I'm audible. So if there is a fluid and you are able to heat it in certain ways, depending on that you'll be able to generate certain shapes. And those shapes, depending on the heating, if you are able to simulate something similar, you have to be able to get shapes that are similar to actual clouds, then you say you have got the qualitative description correct. That is what the experiments have tried to show, that you somehow get this heating. So that gave inspiration that okay, from here you can now go. So in a laboratory, what happened? They simulated these cloud shapes. But it so happened that, because of instrumentation issues and all that, you cannot get data at every point of the total 3D flow behavior. So if you want to get, detailed data of, let's say, velocity, temperature, pressure, one good option is to do a simulation. So the experiment formed the genesis that, okay, the experiment told that you can simulate cloud shapes, and now you do a simulation for it. Next, please. So this, now cloud, an actual cloud, when the water vapor condenses in it, it is like a system wherein the latent heat is released within the system. But the bottom line is, somehow latent heat is released. What happens in the experiment, the heat was supplied externally, basically current was supplied, and that was converted to I square RT. So whether it is internal generation of heat or you supply electricity that gets converted to heat, the bottom line is it is some heating is being provided. So what Professor Narasimha did, he called this external supply of heat into a plume. So what is basically a plume? It's very simple to understand. The smoke rising from a cigarette is a plume. So what happens? You keep, let's say, a hot patch. You heat up this, this. Let's say my palm. If you can heat up, because it heats up, the air around it will get heated up and it will rise up. Right. So that is a simple plume. So once the air rises up at a certain height, just try to imagine that this thing that is rising up contains water vapor. So after a certain height, we know in the atmosphere that as vapor rises up, the upper atmosphere is colder, right? So once this vapor goes to a colder levels, it can somehow reach saturation temperature. It gets saturated because the temperature is lower at, one of the important things is that temperature is lower at upper levels, and it can condense. So now what happens? The fluid is rising up somehow. At the bottom, you supplied some amount of heat, fluid is rising up. Then you supply this external heat, okay, by I square RT or whatever. And that is called a plume with an external source of heating. We all know the word diabatic. It's not an adiabatic term. Diabatic is external source of heating. It is transient, so it's called a transient diabatic plume. So what he said was the transient diabatic plume, if you can subject it to appropriate amounts of heating, okay, it is a promising model for a cumulus cloud. That was the basic idea that came out from the experiments. Okay, next. So as I said, this transient diabatic plume, what is the origin of it? Transient means lasting for a very short time, which is of course a cloud. Next. Diabatic, external addition of heat. It's not an adiabatic system. It is latent heat release in clouds. The external addition of heat that we do in experiments is like latent heat release. Next. And it's a plume. So as I said, it is heated up here, it rises up, that's a normal plume. You supply external heat, that is called a transient diabatic plume. Yeah, next. And we know that all flows are almost certainly turbulent. Very rarely we will see laminar, flows that are very orderly flows. So it is so especially in situations like this, after let's say the smoke is rising from a cigarette or a small bonfire, it gets disturbed at a very small distance from the source. It's almost certainly turbulent. So in our thing, we study turbulent flows. Next. So this is a schematic. This was done by one of his students, Professor Narasimha's students, who wrote the basic code for that we run. So you can see at the bottom there is a hot patch just at the bottom most, whose diameter is T0 and temperature is T0. This hot patch, as we know that because of it will rise up. So it rises up a certain level, and then after a certain level we add heat. So the shaded region is the region where we add heat. That shaded region we term as the heat injection zone. Why is it called a heat injection zone? It is because let's say in experiment electricity was passed and I square RT heating occurred. That's why it was called an external heat injection zone. And of course, because of this external addition of heat, more buoyancy is caused. So buoyancy is a very important aspect of these flows. We all know what buoyancy is. Next. So since we talk of turbulence, I thought of it might be a decent idea to give a very brief introduction to turbulence, because more often than not we understand what turbulence is, but we don't study much about it. So you can see this is a turbulence signal. It is just from the book by Davidson. So this is the velocity. You can see it's a velocity at a particular point in space. If it is turbulent, with time it will show a lot of oscillations. Of course, you can find out a mean. You add up all the velocities over a long period of time at that particular point, you will obviously get an average. Okay. So this u bar is an average that you see in the figure, and instantaneously the time trace of it is the fluctuating turbulence signal. Next. The question is there any definition for turbulence? So the point is, see, this is what the book has said, and it's by and large true. There is a long-standing tradition in turbulence of studiously avoiding any definition of what we mean by a turbulent eddy. Now, turbulence is full of eddies. If you don't have an eddy, you don't have a turbulent flow. Or for that matter, turbulence, basically people try to avoid it. It is almost as if we fear that as soon as we try to define an eddy, the entire concept will melt away, proving to be entirely illusory. Means we define eddy on a certain ways, and then somebody else will come and ask, are you sure that is a definition? So people find it difficult, but we know what turbulence is. For the above figure you have seen that is turbulent. We know velocities are wildly fluctuating. That is turbulence. Next. So this is one definition for turbulence. So let us talk of only incompressible fluid flows. You know what is incompressible? Density is constant. So one definition of turbulence is incompressible fluid turbulence is a spatially complex distribution of vorticity which adverbs itself in a chaotic manner. The vorticity field is random in both space and time and exhibits a wide range of continuous distribution of length and time scale. So let us just think that there is a concept called vorticity, which is advecting itself. Basically, it's convection. Advection is, you can even name it convection. We know what is convection, movement of a fluid from one location to another location, and it's chaotic. Chaos also we understand. But the concept over here, vorticity. Vorticity is a very, very important aspect of turbulence, and we will look into in this whatever I'll be discussing today. Over here, vorticity is a very important aspect. That's why I have taken this definition. Next. So the basic queries are, what is the connection between velocity and the vorticity? Vorticity, let me define it by omega. We all know, vorticity is called del cross V. That is, it is twice the angular, velocity. But we seek to understand what is the deeper connection maybe between velocity and vorticity. Secondly, what is an eddy? That's another concept. In the previous page we spoke of eddy, and here also we're talking of eddy and vorticity. So these are basic queries. The next, please. So let's again go. This is the Navier-Stokes equation, which we all know. This capital D by dt is called the material derivative that I hope some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Basically, when we say material derivative, we are trying to follow a material object. Okay, that means we are trying to analyze what is happening to the fluid particle as it moves in space as it moves in space. So this is the basic Navier-Stokes equation. It is, you can see on the right hand side, there is a pressure. Of course, we know many times the pressure drives fluid flow.
Next no date barkolra.
Sorry?
Next 6th barkole 6 8.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Mr. Sri Rama. I think there was some disturbance, sir. I think he has muted his mobile. You can carry on.
Fine. So on the right hand side, the first term is the pressure term, gradient of pressure. We know that in the Hagen-Poiseuille flows, in a pipe, the pressure gradient the dpdx, if x is the direction of flow, the dpdx drove the flow. So pressure gradient is very important, and the last term on the right hand side is the frictional term, the viscosity or the kinematic viscosity here. Next. Now, if you take the curl, what was the vorticity was defined as delt cross V. So what happens of the Navier-Stokes equation 1, you need to take the curl of it. If we take the curl of it, we will get an equation for vorticity. That is the next equation 2. So there is an equation for vorticity that comes by taking the curl of the Navier-Stokes equation. Next, please. The point is, the velocity and the vorticity are very intimately related. So, and that is intimately related to something called the Biot-Savart law. What it basically says that, let's say you have in a certain region of space, you have a lot of vorticity. That fluid is obviously rotating and all kinds of things are happening because the fluid is it's a very turbulent field. The particle is getting twisted, elongated, so on. So you can see that we at any location x, x is a vector, at any location x, there is some vorticity around wherever it is. Wherever be the vorticity, let's say vorticity is concentrated at a location that is far away. This is this on my whatever I'm showing here. This is the location we are trying to concentrate on, and there is some high amount of vorticity in this region. Okay. The point is, a vorticity in this region affects what is the velocity over here, and that comes out to the Biot-Savart law. So we are integrating, we are trying to find out what is happening at a location x on the left hand side, and we are integrating over all points x dash, which may or may not, which may be different from this x, and the vorticity at all these points, when you do an integral over the entire volume, it can affect the velocity at that point. That is the Biot-Savart law. Next. So now let's go to the definition of an eddy. An eddy is a coherent, vertical, turbulent structure. So what is vertical? Basically, vertical means it is full of vorticity. Basically, that region, that eddy is something that goes around, has a lot of rotation in it. I'll explain that in a little bit more pictorial. It will be very easy to understand. And why is it called coherent? We know the word coherent. Basically, coherence means a lot of good correlation is there between different regions. That's what is called a coherent. There is some nice coherence over there. So it is a region which has some nice coherence. It is not a lumped body. When you say a lumped body, means the properties are same everywhere. It is not that the properties are same everywhere. It is just that it is like every particle is somehow related to the movement of the other particle in that region of space, which has a lot of rotational effect. Next. Yeah, let's see a Jupiter's red spot. We have all heard of Jupiter's red spot. So on the left side of the figure, you can see there is a nice red spot in the bottom half, somewhere in the middle region. That's Jupiter's red spot. It is really a rotating. It was, I think, first found out by Galileo, and so that is an example of an eddy. It is very disturbed. We know it is not a smooth flow, but somehow something is happening. So that's a very good example of an eddy. And of course, now you are also seeing on the right hand side, people have tried to simulate a Jupiter-like planet, because atmospheric scientists or planetary scientists do that. People who try to find out, life on other planets, they want to also study other planets. So you can see lots of small blue and all those things, blue, red. So those are small eddies. They are not at the microscopic level, at the molecular level. They are much bigger than that. But small regions that seem to have an existence of their own. They will not last forever. They last for a brief period of time. But in that brief period of time, they will have an existence of their own. Yeah. Next. So turbulence is full of eddies of all sizes. So you have, generally there will be a larger eddy that moves, and we know there's fluid instabilities are there. For whatever reason, the fluid becomes unstable. This larger thing, somewhere around that is going to break down because of instability, and smaller size eddies are going to created. This smaller size will again break down. So continuously there is a breakdown from the larger scale to the smaller scale, And also the system is such that the large scales might also be continuously be created at the same time. Like the Jupiter's red spot. It is continuously being sustained. Doesn't mean there are no smaller eddies. It is smaller eddies are also there within that. Next. So one of the very good things was done by Leonardo da Vinci. You can see on the left hand side, there is this fluid coming in. There is coming in on the left side of the figure, right? And fluid is coming. You can see Leonardo da Vinci in his drawing. He has shown many small, bigger regions. You can see one big region surrounding the entire system of the fluid, and there are small circulating parts. So he, at that time, was somehow able to understand that this turbulent flow, what are the disturbed flow, has some big regions that have certain motion, and within that there are smaller regions, which is what pictorially is represented on the right side. Bigger gets broken down into smaller, gets broken down into smaller and smaller, till a reasonable small sizes, comes about. Next. So this is called Richardson cascade. Whirls means something that is like a whirlpool, right? So big whirls have little whirls, okay, which feed on their velocity. Basically, it's basically telling that there is an instability. So what happens? These big whirls, they have a certain amount of energy, okay. When it breaks down, this big energy is transferred to the smaller, structures, as is shown on the right hand side of this slide, top right. Where will the energy go? So the big one gives rise to smaller ones. So it's basically saying the smaller ones will get energy from the bigger ones, and these intermediate ones will again break down till it comes down to viscosity. That we will explain. Next. So basically, pictorially, it is again saying that you have these larger eddies in the middle that will break down continuously break down. The breakdown finally stops when molecular viscosity becomes important. Next. So why is this? Suppose there is something called non-dimensionalization of the equation. Basically, we try to it is something like dynamic similarity, not exactly the same. We know that you have done dynamic similarity where you try to simulate, let's say fighter aircraft. You make a smaller scale model of it, study it in a wind tunnel, and say that the same results are valid for the bigger thing. So basically, you're trying to find the similarity. So there is something called non-dimensionalization. Next, please. So when you do this non-dimensionalization, this is how the Navier-Stokes equation looks like. So you can see on the right hand side, the original Navier-Stokes equation has been modified, and on the right hand side, the viscous term has become 1 by REL. All I am trying to say from this particular equation is that the viscous term has become 1 by REL. What is REL? REL is defined as Reynolds number based on, let's say, a large scale velocity. Right, there is a large scale velocity somehow that represents the overall, not the small scale, let's say the overall velocity that occurs in a particular system. If you're not very clear, you can ask me. So you have this Reynolds number, and with large scale velocity, a certain large scale length and viscosity. You can see in the non-dimensionalized Navier-Stokes equation, the Reynolds number has been defined. Okay. This capital V is a representative large velocity. So when the Reynolds number is quite high, there is no effect of viscosity. It's almost as if the viscosity doesn't exist. So the breakdown of the larger eddy does not happen because of viscosity. It actually happens because of certain amount instabilities are created. Now when you go to smaller and smaller scales, what happens? I'll just tell what happens that the Reynolds number at the smaller scale becomes very small. See, the Reynolds number at the large scale, if you see this equation, was V at the large scale, length of a very large scale, viscosity. When you go to a very small scale, it will become velocity of the small scale, length at the small scale. So overall, the numerator reduces. And that is when the numerator reduces, the viscosity starts becoming very important. So once the viscosity at a small scale, that becomes important, okay, the fluctuations which occur because of instabilities in the one of the reasons why because the instabilities that occur and which finally give rise to turbulence, the huge oscillations, viscosity will damp down the oscillations at the smallest scales. So if you from the large scale there might be huge oscillations. When you go to very small scales, the oscillations will be killed by viscosity. So no longer there will be an eddy, instabilities will no longer arise in a very crude sense if we just see. So that is when till the viscosity comes, the turbulence exists. Next. So let's talk of turbulence simulations. Any quantity, any variable is divided into a mean and a fluctuation, which we had seen in this previous figure. There was a mean and a fluctuation. There was this was the fluctuation, and if you take a long-term average, there is a mean. That mean I define on the right-hand side by a phi bar. Okay, that's a mean, and then there is a deviation from the mean by a phi dash. So the dash is a fluctuation and the bar is a mean. So we decompose it mathematically. Next. So this mean quantity is basically well behaved. We saw that nicely this mean quantity was so beautiful to look at. There's no oscillations and all that, which is so difficult to quantify the oscillations. Mean is well behaved, but there is a problem. Next. We can find, so mean is well behaved. So what people have done, they have tried to find out an equation for the mean, because mean is so well behaved. Let us try to get the mean correctly through an equation. So they did an equation for that, for the mean. Okay, so when people found the mean, you can see the right hand side of the figure of this particular equation. There was a mean, let's say for the velocity, we are trying to find out the mean velocity, let's say v mean. On the right hand side, we see there is a dash term, there's a fluctuation term is there. So this fluctuation term, when we try to find out the mean, somehow a fluctuation term is coming into the picture. We cannot avoid this. Okay, next. So this fluctuating term, this fluctuating part, we have no idea about it. As I said, fluctuations are difficult for us to find out. So at the mean is well behaved, we try to find out an expression for the mean, but a fluctuation comes. If we try to find out how do I find out the fluctuations? Finding out the fluctuations will give rise to even more unknowns. Okay, next. So basically, when we try to find out the mean, we get trapped into more and more sets of unknowns, and that is called the closure problem of turbulence. Sometimes many people refer to this as the closure problem. Basically, the problem is never closed. We will never find a complete set of equations that you have, let's say, 5 equations, 5 unknowns. No, there always, if you find an equation for the mean, there will be more unknowns than the number of equations. That's the closure problem. Next. So what can we do? People try to model the fluctuating terms in terms of known parameters. This is where the modeling and the assumptions come into reality. So how good our model is with respect to reality, we just try to somehow model this. That is what is turbulence modeling. So this VI, VJ are called trying to model, that is known as a one-point closure model. There are of course other more sophisticated models also can be done. For example, K epsilon model, which you might have, some of you might be doing it in some simulations in let's say ANSYS. K epsilon, K omega model, these are all turbulence models trying to find out these fluctuating components and close the system in terms of knowns. Yeah, next. Okay, there is something called a large eddy simulation also. So what do we do in large eddy simulations? Now we have seen that as I had explained before, that you have a large eddy that breaks down into smaller eddies. Okay, and these small eddies you have to go up to the viscous level, and that's a really very small level. So what we do in large eddy simulations, we don't go through the entire spectrum, that is from largest to smallest. We go from largest up to a certain size. Okay, so and after a certain size, we no longer simulate it. We try to find out a model for it. If you see the equation 5, it just talks of a mean. We are not talking of large scale, small. We're just taking a mean. Now in LES, we are taking the large, bigger AD, smaller AD up to a certain size of the smaller AD. After the certain size, we try to model it. Okay, that's a large AD simulation. This is very practical and highly used nowadays. Next. So very important, there is something called a Kolmogorov or dissipation scales, that is at the scale at which the viscosity becomes important. So let me just say at the large scale there is a velocity, VL, and L is the large scale. For example, what people say, suppose I'm in my room, the large scale is the velocity, the average velocity that you find when the fan is running. And the large scale will be approximately the size of the room, that is any length or width or whatever, any one particular size. Dissipation scales are very small, where the viscosity acts. Next. These things can be shown. The velocity at the smallest scale, so 6a, it should be on the left hand side v suffix eta, which I have missed putting. So this v suffix, eta, this is actually, it is related to the Reynolds number and the velocity. I think there is another mistake. It should be Reynolds number to the power minus 1 by 4. I think there is a mistake over here, which, but nonetheless, the smallest scale is related to the largest scale through the large scale Reynolds number, which we defined before. Okay, and the smallest scale, the length scale eta, which is equation 6b, that is also defined in terms of the large scale Reynolds number. Okay, there is a dissipation which is epsilon. Basically, dissipation is nothing but how the viscosity removes the energy, because the viscosity, we all know the viscosity tries to slow down a fluid. Basically, it is removing the kinetic energy, the energy of the fluid, right? Because at the viscous level, the viscosity acts and removes of the energy. So that this 6c is just an expression for the dissipation. Let's not worry about that too much. Okay, next. For example, let's talk of air. Let's say an average velocity is 2 meters per second, and length is, let's say 3 meter, and Reynolds number is 10 raised to 4 meter. The scale at which dissipation becomes important is 0.1 mm. So if you really want to simulate turbulence at all scales, you have to go from that 0.3 meter, that is the length of the large scale, up to 0.1 millimeter, and that's a huge amount of length scales. 0.3, that is almost 1 foot, to 0.1 millimeter. Next, that's how much the scales can be. So turbulence occurs to the smallest scales. Beyond the smallest scale, the viscosity will damp it down. Next. So we need to simulate till the smallest scales to get all the details of turbulence. Next. For example, what can be shown is that you had the smallest scale of turbulence that was somehow related to the Reynolds number, the large scale Reynolds number. It can be shown that the smallest scale, eta cube, will be proportional to Reynolds number of the large scale to the power minus 9 by 4. So what does it mean? If Reynolds number is a very large number, eta has to be very small. So you need a huge amount of grid boxes to simulate it. That causes a lot of computational requirements. Next. And now, suppose you had a Reynolds number of, let's say 10,000 or 1,000, whatever. You want to increase it 10 times. Okay. Now, when you increase the Reynolds number, it so happens that the smallest scale at which viscosity becomes important, that scale reduces. Suppose you have a Reynolds number of, as in the previous slide, I had shown the Reynolds number of 10 raised to power of, 1 raised to power 4, 10 raised to power 4. The viscous scale was 0.1 mm. Now suppose you increase the Reynolds number to 10 raised to power 5, 10 times it, the viscous scale will become much more smaller than that. And equation 8, tells us what is the viscous scale. So n is a number larger than 1, and when you increase the Reynolds number by n times, you have to get into a much more finer grid. Again, that's a trouble to resolve all the scales in turbulence. Next. Yeah. So such simulations are basically computationally very expensive. Okay, because you have to resolve a very small scales, and even if you slightly increase the Reynolds number, you'll have to make the scale, grid resolution even finer. And high number of grid points means the storage size is very high. That is one of the problems that we face. If storage space requirements are very high, we have to use a huge amount of computation to even analyze that huge amount of data. Yeah, next. Yeah, so basically there is something called a direct numerical simulations, where we are not going to simulate the mean or the large eddy up to a certain level. We are making the grid fine enough that we simulate the larger scale up to the scale where the viscosity becomes important, because from the larger scale up to close to the viscosity, there will be turbulence. So if we have the grid size small enough that we're going up to the dissipation scale, that the viscosity becomes important, we have basically resolved all the scales of of the turbulence. That's what we say. That is direct numerical simulation, where there are no models used. We are not using any models whatsoever. Next. It is very advantageous for research because we get all the values of the velocity, pressure, density, temperature, and so on at every at every point, and we get the actual values. To the extent that the equations that we discretize and simulate, the discretization is correct. Of course, if the discretization is wrong for the equations, we'll obviously not be able to get the actual simulation that is close to reality. Next. But it's very advantageous for research. The limitation is computationally expensive. Even if Reynolds number is modest, still the number of grid points has to be very fine. Data storage requirements up to petabytes is required. Okay, and of course results are limited by the quality of the discretized governing equations, which is of course the case for even if you do the the Reynolds stress model or the K epsilon model, that also requires a model. So that disadvantage is common for all simulations. Next. Okay, now coming back to clouds. We know that, as we said, that the atmosphere Reynolds number is actually very high, order of 10 raised to 9 or 10 raised to 10. So if the Reynolds number is so high, what happens is that the dissipation scale at the where viscosity becomes important is around 1 millimeter to I think 10 millimeter for the Reynolds number that is available in the atmosphere. So if we have a grid resolution of around 10 millimeter, and the Earth's circumference is itself around 40,000 kilometers, and we want to make grids of 10 millimeter, it is impossible to simulate it. Okay, so we have to use cloud models. There is no option for, if you want to simulate the Earth's atmosphere, we have to use clouds models. So where are cloud models used? They are used in atmospheric general circulation models, which simulate the Earth's climate. These are called general circulation models. General circulation models that simulate the atmosphere are called atmospheric general circulation models. Their resolution is of 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 50 kilometers. So you cannot really go to the fine turbulence scale. You have no option but to use a cloud model. So cloud models are used in these cases, even in climate, in weather prediction models. Next. We cannot resolve all the dynamical scales. For example, one of the schemes that is of course quite an old scheme. Nowadays there are more sophisticated schemes. There are, for example, one old scheme is Shubert-Arakawa scheme. In that, because it's a model, you have to tune parameters to get the present climate correctly. There is no option. So very sophisticated exercises of parameters are being tuned. Sometimes parameters are ad hoc, but we don't have an option if we really want to simulate the Earth's climate in a realistic manner. Otherwise, we don't have the infrastructure to do it anywhere in the world. This leads, because we are trying to parameterize it, and the problem is so complex in the Earth's atmosphere, this leads to inaccuracies and uncertainties in future climate prediction scenarios. That's why some people say Earth will heat by 3 degrees. Another model will say it will heat by 2 degrees. Somebody might say it might heat by 5 degrees. Those are the inaccuracies. Next. For example, let's see weather research and forecasting model, which is a very popular model. It is from one US organization which is called National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR. So their resolution of that model is 0.1 kilometer to 1 kilometer, because beyond that you cannot do any meaningful results. But people say it's a cloud resolving model, because clouds sometimes their width can be 2-3 kilometers, and many times clouds, thunder clouds, you can see it covers the entire city. Maybe 5 kilometers it might be wide, and maybe 10 kilometers in height. So if you say that you are resolving 1 kilometer or 100 meters in this weather prediction model, basically you are trying, in some sense you have captured some differences in some, you try to resolve clouds in some way, right? But that's why it's called a cloud resolving model. It's not a turbulence resolving model. People say it's a cloud resolving model, because clouds are bigger in size than whatever will be the resolution of this weather forecasting model. Next. However, the atmospheric general circulation models, they have a resolution of 50 kilometers, which is bigger than that of a single cloud. So you cannot resolve clouds at all in this. So these researchers, they have found out maybe some methods by which they try to resolve clouds by telling that, okay, so if so much of water, so much of sun, let's say so much of sunlight comes and so much of water heats up, it goes up, maybe this kind of amount of latent heat is released. In that sense, they try to model clouds. Of course, it's a more sophisticated exercise, but it's a science of its own, but done by those people in atmospheric sciences. Next. Okay, some previous studies of this type of plumes. First study was done in 1954 by Professor G.K. Batchelor, who is a very well-known guy in turbulence. So he tried to do an analysis of heated, plumes, which is not an off-source heating. What I said was our cloud, it is heated at the bottom. Above it, there is an external addition of heat or a release of latent heat. What he studied was just, a patch heated at the bottom. He analyzed that. Next. And then there was something called Morton and all these people. They did even more detailed analysis in stratified and unstratified. Stratification is what? When density is changing with height. That is called a stratified environment for atmospheric science. Density is changing with height. Stratified and unstratified environment, they did some analysis. Next. Okay. Now, we all know that, when a cloud is heated, of course, when a cloud arises, there is an external addition of heat. Now this external addition of heat gives rise to even more buoyancy effects. So Turner in 1963, he tried to simulate this. He tried to do an experiment for this. That time the computers were, they could not simulate well. So he did experiments where he tried to add buoyancy at a certain height. Just like latent heat release of latent heat adds buoyancy, he tried to add buoyancy, and he added buoyancy by injecting bubbles in a rising column of fluid, light bubbles. So when bubbles are in a bubble of a very light gas is embedded in a heavier gas, obviously it's a source of buoyancy. It becomes lighter, that region becomes lighter, and it became a source of buoyancy. So he said that was probably a decent, one of the models for simulating, for predicting how clouds behave. But that was contested, many people have contested. I've just taken one example. He said that such models, as told by Turner, do not resemble clouds. Next. So on the left hand side of the figure, you can see that, Turner, after heating this, after injecting this buoyancy by means of bubbles, he saw that the rising plume which was heated from the bottom, it rose in a V shape like this. That's what he found out. In various stages it rises up. But on the right hand side, even if you go in an aircraft, sometimes you will see very tall towers coming up. So this is like a cumulus cloud. You say cumulus towers. A tower is not, of course, expanding. So that's where the contradiction came, that probably just any source of buoyancy is not going to be enough. It is important to have a proper source of buoyancy that gives rise to a tower-like shape. Next. So Professor Narasimha, and that time Professor Bhatt was his PhD student. Now, of course, he's a very senior faculty and probably already retired from IISc. They did a systematic study of a plume. Let's leave the self-similarity. So they injected some amount of fluid. It came up. Okay. See, what happens is, let's say, sometimes you inject an amount of fluid by a jet. Okay, the fluid rises up. After a certain distance, the fluid forgets about its initial conditions. It can be made, not always, it can be made under certain circumstances, that the fluid rising up forgets that its initial conditions. So you go to a certain height where the fluid has forgotten its initial, that it has come out from this bottom as a jet. You go to a certain height, it has forgotten, it starts behaving like a plume, a simple plume that rises, and then later on they added heat after a certain height has been achieved. That is what their experiment in a very brief way they did. Next. Now see the figures in their paper, which was, you can see the leftmost side, that there was no heat added. The fluid came from the bottom and became a V-like shape. Now they added heat by those experiments, and what was in a V-shaped became a tower-like shape. So that was a very important thing that people, this paper found out, that you add heat externally, the shape will change. Externally addition of heat, of course, gives buoyancy. Even as Turner did, he added bubbles, that was also buoyancy. But the tower will come, okay, if you add heat in a certain way, not any addition of heat, a certain way in which you add heat, how much of heat is added. That was the important thing. Next. They also reported that heating disrupts the coherent structure. So you all previously, you know that we discussed that the coherent structure was basically like a big eddy that behaved in a certain way. What happened is that when heat was added to that region where an eddy was there, the heat broke off the eddy. It caused the eddy to break down much more easily. Next. So what I'm trying to say is that we have not exactly, a cloud was not done, because a cloud has moisture, it has microphysics, it has impure particles. What was just attempted is, let us try to get the gross features of the flow correctly. That was done by adding heat. So as this work was done by Professor Narasimha, he continued doing it. Let's look at the right hand side of the figures first. That is on the pink and blue type of thing. Just focus on the right side. The left part of the right side. In the middle of the left part of the right side, you can see that there is one dashed like thing, which is like a heart shaped thing. That they said was a structure. That was the unheated jet. So the left side, always in both the figures, the left part is the unheated, the right part is the heated. So the unheated part had a nice structure. When they heated it, the structure, they could not find it out easily. Basically, they said the structure was broken up. Now you see the left hand side of the two figures, figure A. In figures, in A, the left hand side, you can see some kind of ring-like structure around it. It was some kind of a ring-like structure. Whereas on the figure A right side, there is no strong ring-like structure. They said it is broken down, and that was very important for entrainment. They managed to show that because these structures were broken down, entrainment I'll explain, because the structures broke down, the way in which this, this rising column of fluid interacted with the surroundings changed. Okay, that a very important aspect of the way this rising column of fluid interacts with the surroundings, a very important interaction is something known as entrainment. Next. Okay, yeah, this is some more simulations. He performed the DNS. Of course, it was not a very detailed DNS. Next. Okay, so I'll come to entrainment later. Now let me get more into what we have done. There is something called natural convection and the Boussinesq approximation. Okay, in a nutshell, the Boussinesq approximation only says, see, we know that the fluid rises up because of buoyancy. That means a huge amount of density change occurs. Now, what does it, Boussinesq approximation says that if the density change is not very high, okay, let's say the density changes is not very high, but the density change is enough to cause motion. That is the approximation. Density changes are not very high by itself, but should be enough to cause motion. How does it cause motion? Next. Okay, one more next. Okay, so see the red line at the bottom, the density changes are important only when multiplied by G. So just above the red line, okay, density change is rho minus rho naught. Rho naught is, let's say, some reference, density. The rho minus rho naught is very small, okay. But when you multiply delta rho by G, that becomes a large number. Let's say rho minus rho naught is, let's say, 0.1. Okay, if density of air is, let us say, 1, and the difference in density is 0.1, G is approximately 9.81, means 10. So 0.1 multiplied by 10 becomes again 1. Basically, it's trying to say that density differences are small enough to cause the motion, provided it is multiplied by G. That is the Boussinesq approximation. Okay, next. Okay, so what we do when we do this Boussinesq approximation, this is how the equations look like. Okay, you can see the Boussinesq approximation is such that the continuity equation for an incompressible fluid is maintained. Del dot V is actually valid for an incompressible fluid. What happens is the density changes are negligible everywhere except where it is associated with acceleration due to gravity. Delta rho into G is the only place where density is important. Everywhere else it is not important. So in the continuity, del dot V is 0. In the momentum is same as before. If you see the right hand side of equation 10b, that is how in the Boussinesq approximation, the density changes is caused by a small temperature difference. That is the source term. Beta is the coefficient of thermal expansion. That I hope you would have heard of. Because of temperature, when temperature is increased, the fluid will slightly expand. So the density change is caused by the temperature change multiplied by acceleration due to gravity. That is enough to cause a motion. So that is the source term. And this is how the energy looks. If you see the last term of the energy equation, that is how the, it's like an external addition of heat for the energy equation. Energy in terms of temperature. Okay, next. Okay, so these are just some, need to go. So all I'm trying to say is delta T is the temperature inside the rising fluid minus the ambient. And that's not a very large difference, but difference is good enough to cause the motion. Okay, next. So this is our simulation. Okay, this is a schematic. We are doing direct numerical simulations of everything. And this is how you can see the right part, that is the grid geometry. Because we are doing the, the DNS, where we have to resolve everything, we have made the grid very fine in the region where the plume exists. So actually, basically, if this is the entire, entire box over here, right? The plume rises only in the center line. The plume will rise only in the center line, and only around the center line we have made the grid resolution very high. Okay, that's what we have tried to show. And if you see on the left hand side of the figure, which is the schematic, you can see the left between 10 to 15 there is a red, red vertical line. That is where we have added heating in the simulation. Next. So after non-dimensionalizing, this is how we get. Let us not worry too much about it. All because basically, if we non-dimensionalize it, it is something like saying that even at the smaller, so when we non-dimensionalize an equation, we say we have scaled it by a certain level, certain length scale, velocity scale. It helps in generalizing the equation in a certain way. So this is what we have generalized the equation. Let's later on we can maybe you may ask what is this non-dimensionalized, if at all you are interested or you are not clear about it. Next. So we simulate these set of equations. So I'd like to say the code was originally written in C by Prashant, who was an MSc student of Professor Narasimha, and minor modifications were done later. Next. So these are all the boundary conditions, which again, let me not get into too much, detail. So basically, you heat up this, and you have to put certain boundary conditions. That is, you put no slip velocity conditions. You put a no slip condition. You put that there is a certain pressure condition, temperature condition. These are all what has been discussed. Let me not come to that. Next. Next, I don't want to get into the details over here. So basically, I'm saying this is a no slip condition. This is basically isolated. We have made the system isolated except for the pressure, things. Next. Next. Okay, then again, this is the computational technique that was used. So we use a staggered grid in CFD. A staggered grid is very important. Is sometimes very useful for this incompressible fluid flows, because so it is a finite volume technique was used and staggered grid was used. Next. So I'll not discuss this too much. All I'd like to say is that when you do an incompressible fluid flow, because Boussinesq is almost incompressible, except where density differences are multiplied by acceleration due to gravity g. In that event, what you need to do is to solve the pressure, something called a Poisson equation. What is the Poisson equation? It is a forced Laplace equation. So if phi is a variable, del square phi, where del is the gradient operator, phi is a scalar, del square phi is the Laplacian. Del square phi is equal to 0 is a Laplace equation. On the right hand side, if there is a forcing term, it becomes a Poisson equation. So it so happens that we have to solve a Poisson equation over here. Next. After this, next. So I'm not getting into the computational details much. Next. Okay. So we are trying to say the simulated cloud can look very real, very similar to the actual cloud. Simulation as done in direct numerical simulation. Next. You can see the left hand side is the actual cloud, the right hand side is the simulated cloud. That was done by Prashant. Of course, his resolution was not at very high, but as demonstration wise, he had shown that, okay, a simulated, depending on the heating you put, the simulated cloud and the real cloud can look very close in structure. Next. So we have analyzed, we have done the simulation in a supercomputer that is in CSIR 4 pi. It's a 360 teraflop supercomputer. Next. So we used 1.6 billion. When I had done the simulation, I used 1.6 billion grids. 1.6 billion grids means each variable, let's say velocity in the x direction, it gave a file size. If it is written in ASCII format, it would give every time the data is dumped at any particular time step, the data dumped was 20 GB. Imagine just one component of velocity. And if we do 3 components of velocity, pressure, temperature, Imagine the data requirement. So if you convert to binary form, it became around 8 or 9 GB per variable each time it was dumped the data. Next. So I used 3,375 processors, which totally ran for 16 days. Of course, I did not get 16 days continuous time. It had to be spread over 3 months, because you do a certain thing for a certain period of time and then you stop. After 2-3 days, again you are given 3,375 processors. Again you do simulation for some more time. That took about 3 months. Next. So as I said, grid is, we use a Cartesian geometry, and grid is very finely resolved in the central region where the plume rises. Next. Okay, this is the type of heating that is given. Basically, the time. Okay, when we non-dimensionalize time, it is. Let me say it goes to, from when non-dimensional is like 0 to 90 seconds, it is like from 0 to 90 units. It is a non-dimensional time. It does not have any dimension. That's how the non-dimensionalization has been done. So in that, from 0 to 90 only we simulated, and for a certain brief period of time we added heat. This is the type of distribution of heat we did. Let's not again. Next. And that heating was defined based on the shape we tried to get. We had to get a shape where the structure was more or less straight. That's what Professor Narasimha wanted. Next. Okay. Now, as I said, vorticity is very important, and this is the equation for the entire equation for a vorticity for the incompressible fluid. The second term on the right hand, the last term on equation 12, the right hand side, last term, that comes because of density changes. Previously I had shown for the incompressible fluid, now the density is slightly changing. Next. Under the Boussinesq approximation, it can be shown that the last term, right, is equal to beta g cross delta t. Okay, it can be shown, and this is a source term for the vorticity. So the external addition of heat gives rise to a lot of rotation and all these things. That's vorticity. Next. Okay, so this term, this beta g cross del t, it is called a baroclinic torque. Okay, it can be shown to be a torque because of the directions of where it is acting. Basically, it is a source term for the vorticity. Next. So this is the simulation figure. So at different time instances from 0 to 90 I have done. I have shown only certain time instances. You can see how the plume is rising. Okay. Now if you see from the leftmost side to the rightmost side, what has been drawn is the vorticity field. Okay, omega. We take the magnitude of omega. We know the magnitude of any quantity is, the component in the x direction, y direction. We have to square each of the terms and take a square root of that. That is standard for a vector, because omega is a vector. You know how to find the magnitude of a vector. So we have drawn that magnitude. You can see between figure A and figure E, that is the leftmost side, and on the rightmost side, last but one, there is a high increase of vorticity simply because of the addition of heat. What was termed as a baroclinic torque. Next. Okay, we have seen when we started plotting and take the numbers that the vorticity increased by more than 10 times. Okay, that is what these figures actually show because of the addition of heat. You can see at figure E at around the height of 20, figure E rightmost but one, it is very high vorticity is there over there. Next. Okay. Now this is something called buoyancy. We all know the buoyancy is increased because of the addition of heat. Even with a mild addition of heat, even when a heat is added in a very small amount such that the density changes are not so high, the buoyancy increased by a huge amount because of the multiplication by the quantity called g over here. If you see, it is minus beta into g. Next. So basically what we are trying to say in these figures, let's see any one of the figures, both are same. Let's say figure A on the left. You can see there are huge vertical, these vertical things. So on the vertical, you can see there is a huge amount. It is almost like this. And at the bottom, there are some very small horizontal lines almost sticking onto the base. Okay. So those things are in a situation almost sticking to the base, there is no increase of buoyancy. However, once heat was added, the buoyancy increased by almost 100 times. Okay, that's what we found out. The buoyancy increased by 100 times even with a small addition of heat. So basically we say these two different kinds of flow regimes. Once when there is no heat addition, huge, very small addition of heat, adding it changes the flow quite a lot. Next. So there you can see, again I have shown the figures. See what is entrainment. If you can see the figure, let's say figure B. See one is the vertical section, how it grows like this, and then comes the horizontal section which is cut in this way, vertical and horizontal. So figure A is a vertical, the figure B is called along the diameter, so it's called a diametral section, that's a horizontal section. You can see, can you see those arrows? I hope you can see those arrows. So what is happening, lot of fluid is coming into that region. So there is the fluid, you can see that some regions are colored and just outside it there is no color. So bottom line is, actually there is a very sharp differentiation between where the plume is rising and just outside. It is not a gradual decrease of velocity. It's a very abrupt change in velocity at the edge of the system. Okay, and lot of velocity from outside. Suppose this is the edge of the plume, lot of velocity from outside comes in, and that is very important for us to quantify. Because in a rising cloud, if lot of fluid from outside comes in, it will dilute the cloud. It will not reach saturation maybe. Right? So that's a very outside fluid coming in is called entrainment. Next. So ambient fluid enters the plume. This process is called entrainment. Next. So, for example, because now what are these various curves? These are curves at various heights. Let's forget about all these points that are being shown. We just show at different heights. See, the lowermost curve is at a low height. The uppermost curve is at a higher height. The plume is rising in the vertical. So the lowermost, what it is showing is the total amount of mass crossing a particular cross section vertically. So because there is less amount of fluid that is at a lower level, okay, as the plume arises, lot of fluid from outside comes in. At a lower level, there is less amount of fluid that has come in from outside, so the mass flux is less, the mass crossing the cross section. At a higher level, more amount of fluid has come in from else, so the mass crossing is more. It is something like fluid is coming in this way and it has to move upwards. Right? So the upper curves are for higher levels, lower curves are for lower levels. That's all these figures are trying to show. That means a lot of entrainment from outside is coming in. Next. So entrainment is very important to understand the life and behavior of clouds. If clouds get diluted too much, then it may not get saturated enough because of dilution, or adequate condensate might not happen, because let's say condensation has happened here and a lot of air is there, it will not really fall down, because for that if droplets have to fall down, small droplets have to coalesce together, and if there is too much of outside air, too much of dilution, they will not coalesce together enough to fall down as rainfall. Next. Okay, so there is a method to quantify entrainment. So if Q is the amount of mass flux at any height, let's say Q is coming here and going, okay, let's say between these two heights, certain amount of fluid is coming in between these two heights. So mass flux at this height and mass flux at the upper height are different. and if vertical is z, rate of change of mass flux with height tells us how much fluid has come in, isn't it? So that's what equation 14 is telling. The Q is the mass flux and at any height, the rate of change of mass flux tells us how much fluid is coming in, and that is directly related to the entrainment. Next. Okay, there is this term called alpha. You can see in equation 14 right hand side there is a term called alpha E that is defined as the entrainment coefficient. How much of a fluid is trying to come in through a certain coefficient. Finding that coefficient is very important for us. Okay, next. Okay, so there is now something called a turbulent non-turbulent interface. Basically what we are trying to say, in the one of the previous figures you saw that you could get the plume as a very sharp boundary. So in this sharp boundary the fluid was very turbulent. Just outside it, actually it was not turbulent. That's what is actually seen in all these types of flows. Very turbulent in the region which is rising, a very sharp drop in the properties across a very thin region where it becomes, very smooth behavior. So this sharp region across which a drop occurs is called the turbulent non-turbulent interface. Why is it important? Because it is across this interface that fluid is coming from outside to inside, across this very sharp thing. So identification of this turbulent non-turbulent interface is very important. Okay, next. So we need to have a measure of the turbulent region of the transient diabatic plume, where outside, if this is thing, outside it is turbulent, outside the plume it is non-turbulent, inside it is turbulent. We need to have a proper definition of it, which defines where the plume is actually turbulent. Next. This is captured by the non-turbulent interface. Next. So many studies have been carried out. Unfortunately, in plumes that much more, and transient diabatic plume, I do not know of any study that has been done till now and published on this type of a flow that simulates a cloud. In simulation wise, it has not been done on the sharp boundary. Next. Okay, so people have done various kinds of influences on how the turbulent non-turbulent interface, but only for jets, as I said. Next. Okay, so for the interest of maybe time, let me skip this. Next. So very closely as a schematic I am showing, you can see the bottom part. See at the bottom there is a lot of vorticity. I have taken it from one particular paper as a schematic. See, this is for a jet, not for a plume. See the bottom figure, there is a lot of vorticity inside. Just outside it's all quiet, and you can see those boundary over there, that is called the turbulent non-turbulent interface, across which the very quiet region suddenly becomes turbulent. Okay, next. And across this thing a lot of fluid comes in somehow. Okay, next. So the nature of flow increases a lot due to heat addition. And next, see, if you remember that the fluid is rising up and then you heat in this height. So in this region the vorticity was actually less. Now you added heat at a certain height. This gave rise to a lot of buoyancy, and this made the vorticity very high over here. So there are two different kinds of flow regimes. So it is we found it very difficult to say that the turbulent non-turbulent boundary here and here are somewhat similar. We found it a bit difficult. So it became very important for us. We spent a considerable amount of time in trying to figure out how to properly get this turbulent non-turbulent interface. For that, what we did, we tried to find out azimuthal averages. So what is an azimuthal average? Azimuth, maybe that's the direction along the circle. So let's say you have the temperature. In this particular plume region, temperature is continuously varying across. So what you do, you take a point here you average at a particular radius. You just keep averaging it. So you average along the entire 360 degrees, the temperature at one particular height, you average it, you will get a particular value of temperature for that radius. You change the radius, again average along the radius, you will get another value of temperature. So this is what we did in trying to find out. Come, next. So this is how we try to find out the azimuthal averages, that is the azimuthal direction is phi, of vertical velocity w and temperature. Next. And after this, what we could find out was using this azimuthal, we tried to find out something called the volume flux and momentum flux. So you can see that what is volume area, let's say volume flux is, we all know A into velocity, area into velocity, that's what we have done. Vertical velocity W into 2 pi r dr. Basically, I have removed the pi over here, it doesn't matter, it is just, so 2 into r dr is the volume flux. Momentum, is always, rho a v square, density is almost constant in Boussinesq, so a v square, so the vertical velocity square times 2 r dr, it is like the momentum flux. That's how we found out, and we did some next. Okay, with that we defined something called a local length scale and a velocity scale. So these are all just, so if you see that the QL is a volume and square root of momentum, if you see the units, it gives rise to a length. Okay, it is just a mathematical operation that we have done. Similarly, for WL, we found out momentum divided by volume. Momentum by volume is of course a velocity. So with that we define certain length scales and velocity scales. Next. And using that we also scaled the vorticity. So basically you had the vorticity that we drew. If we multiply that vorticity by the length scale and the velocity scale, that is R and W, we defined a new vorticity. Okay, we just defined it in this way, that is called a scaled vorticity, because we are scaling by the number R and W, RL, WL. Next. We do not need to discuss this. Next. Okay. Okay, so after, can you just let us skip these things? Let's skip. Next. 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 Now let us look at this. I said vorticity is very important. In those figures, those shaded figures, what we drew was the vorticity. Okay, in those colored figures, what we had shown in those filled figures, vorticity was not there outside, vorticity became very high within that plume. So you can see over here, this is, you are heating at a certain height, you are heating over here. I have drawn vorticity at a height that is below where the heat has been added. I have drawn vorticity at a height below where the heat has been added. We have drawn vorticity at the height where the heat has been added, and vorticity at a height above where the heat has been added. We can see that there is a huge change in vorticity. When Z is equal to, figure left A, 8.5, heat has not been added at that height, because heat has been added between 10 to 15 heights. Okay, 10 to 15 heights heat has been added. Below that, vorticity is small. Okay, then heat has been slightly added at 13.5, and after that you can see the huge jump in vorticity of the local vorticity. Next. However, now when we use the scaled vorticity, that is the vorticity multiplied by the length scale and velocity scale, okay, somehow it so happened that this new vorticity defined by this length scale and velocity scale, vorticity multiplied by the length scale by the velocity scale, it so happened that at all heights the vorticity, this new vorticity, started looking roughly comparable in magnitude. That you can see from this figure. See, the bottom sides of the figures D, E and F show that this new scaled vorticity, the magnitudes at all heights are roughly comparable. So that was very important for us, because this actually we found would help us in demarcating the turbulent non-turbulent interface. Next. Okay, now you can see on the left side that A, B, C figures are the original vorticity. Okay, the vorticity you can see is in figure, let's say figure C. At the bottom, let's say between 10 to 15 the vorticity is low, around 20 the vorticity is very high. What we found out after scaling, you can see figure E, F, G, we found, you can see the colors are roughly similar. Actually, we found out that the colors are roughly similar. So in all three cases, we found that the local vorticity makes the, once we scale it, the vorticity at all heights, the vorticity, this new vorticity becomes roughly similar. So what happens now, the benefit that we had is that, let us say the turbulent. When we say turbulent means the vorticity has to be a certain magnitude. Okay, vorticity goes up. Okay, at the bottom level, let's say the vorticity increased from 0 to 1. At the top, it increased from 0 to, let's say, 100. So we found it difficult to actually put a number actually where the, where we can say the turbulence increases, because over here it increased suddenly from 0 to, let's say, 100. At the bottom, it increased from 0 to 1. But when we scaled it, more or less everywhere, let's say it increases from 0 to 10, the scaled vorticity. So numbers at the top and numbers at the bottom became similar. That helped us in demarcating, okay, a common number for the entire surface of the, to denote the turbulent non-turbulent interface. Next. Let us not discuss this. Next. So I'll stop the basic all the discussion over here. I'll stop. So as I said, entrainment happens across the non-turbulent from outside to inside across this turbulent non-turbulent interface, because inside is turbulent, outside is not a turbulent fluid. And because the fluid was heated at the middle and the turbulence increased a huge amount, we found it difficult to actually separate. Okay, and this is the point where fluid becomes turbulent. Once we scaled it, we found a more uniform number for all the heights for the turbulence. Okay. Next, I'll discuss what are the difficult things that come. So what are the issues to be addressed now? Exactly how entrainment is occurring. So we found out the surface across which the entrainment is occurring for a heated plume, which was never done before, because the properties changed before heating and after heating. Okay. What are the issues that now need to be addressed? Coherent structures come in all sizes and shapes. Okay. At here there is, at the lower there is one coherent structure, above there is one coherent structure. It comes in all sizes and shapes. And actually, because of heating, the coherent structures get broken down. So how do we capture them? Okay, so that is a challenge. Okay, so these are issues that still need to be addressed. Next. Okay, then see this interface. Okay, let us now we have found out a common number to define the interface by this local scaled vorticity, because vorticity is a very important field. But let's say a velocity is fluid is trying to come in. Okay, let's say it's trying to come in 10 meters per second. But this particular interface is itself moving at 2 meters per second. So the fluid has to come in at relative velocity relative to the interface. And tracking the interface is itself very difficult. Right, because it's a turbulent fluid, the interface itself will change. So we have to find out the velocity of the interface. That there are one or two techniques some people have discussed. We are yet to go into that aspect. How does one find out the velocity relative to this moving interface itself? Next. Of course, this is another question, that what causes the velocity? Is it that because of coherent structures or not coherent structures? Pictorially I'll try to explain later on. Next. These are certain issues. And okay, let me not get into this aspect. Next. Okay, what is the nature of the TNTI before heating? So as I said before, that below the heating there is a certain behavior, above the heating there is a certain behavior. So the turbulent, non-turbulent interface below the heating and above the heating changes. Of course, we have divided by certain numbers and tried to get a common number, but the dynamics is essentially different. We have to also capture the dynamics of the turbulent, non-turbulent interface. That's also a very important fluid dynamical aspect. Just for people just to understand what is happening to the interface before and after heating. These are all issues to be addressed. Next. So this is one of the things that was done by for a jet. It is not published. It is I've taken it from this Prashant. You can see that you see the left hand side. There is a nice colored region, right? That is like a coherent structure. It is moving in this way. Okay, it is moving in this way, and as it moves in this way, it is taking the outside fluid inside on the left hand side. So that was very easy to identify that, okay, this is a structure, some kind of an eddy structure that is taking in fluid from outside to inside. But you see the right hand side, fluid is still coming out from outside to inside. But you cannot find a very strong structure. There is, the different colors, red and blue, means something is moving in clockwise, something is moving in anti-clockwise. So if something is moving in clockwise, something is moving in anti-clockwise, basically they are opposing motions. So it is difficult to easily identify how these various opposing motions cause fluid to come in. Okay, left hand side is clear, right hand side is again, I believe, not so clear. As clear as the left hand side. Next. So what is our group doing? We are trying to still quantify the turbulent, non-turbulent interface through various things like entropy. Entropy is the square of the vorticity. We are trying to do that because it further helps, because we are trying to concentrate on the turbulent, non-turbulent interfaces, so the mechanics of it. Next. Then we need to, of course, filter data, get large scale structures, try to get the structures properly, because the structures we believe are very important for how the fluid comes in, right? Because the huge structure that is rotating like this will cause an amount of fluid to come in. Next. Then as I said, find better methods to capture the coherent structures. Next. So another thing that we are doing, because this heated plume is so difficult, it is easier to just study a simple plume, that is just a patch heated over here and it rising up without any addition of heat in the middle. That makes it easier, although it has been studied a little bit more. No one has studied this heated plume in a simulation, a heated thing. But to make our understanding better, we have decided that, okay, we just heat up this and see a simple plume that is rising up. Let us try to understand that. So IIT Jammu has a 3000 processor super computer. We have begun simulating that now. Next. That's what our group is doing. So future plans is, when we do this, we are doing DNS, direct numerical simulations, where we are trying to capture all the scales. Now, of course, we cannot do DNS for the real life. It's a good thing to do large eddy simulation where we capture only a certain number of scales. Now, if we do only a certain number of scales using some open source software, this is called OpenFOAM, can we now simulate? Can we get results that is similar to DNS? If not, how do we model the turbulence using these LES models? Because we have to model the smaller scales, because we have not captured all the smaller scales. How do we do that? So these are all part of the future plans. Next. Yeah, so this is basically what I said. This is how we are planning to do our work. Next. Yeah, I think this completes my talk. These are all the references.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, Dr. Samrat. So it was really a very wonderful talk, very insightful talk. So let's call our participants if they have any doubt, if they want to ask any question with you. So participants, dear participants, please come up and ask your questions. Hello. Hello. hello, participants. If you have any doubt, any question you want to share with Dr. Samrat, please can share. Okay, Dr. Samrat, actually, I want to ask one thing. Like you said that entrainment is happening at a very large scale wherever the flow, the vorticity is high in the azimuthal direction.
Yes.
One thing that always wonder me, like a cloud, you see we all see the cloud every day, and it actually, I think even from the participant side, they might be thinking like the very basic thing, like why these clouds, if they are intaking so many air, why don't they fragment it so much, and why do they fragment it? Like why do they still stuck together as a plume, as a white kind of white wool weather and all, you know? So why don't they fragment if they have like intaking the air with such a high rate at the because of that azimuthal vortex which you explained? Like what is that typical thing, the number you said it's which is important to keep them floating and all?
So what happens is,
that you said something, right?
Yeah, so we should, to generalize this question, see, entrainment occurs in a jet, outside fluid comes into a jet also, it comes in a simple fluid also, it also comes when you see a cigarette fume also, as it goes above a certain level, entrainment comes.
Right.
So after some time,
and they won't last for a long.
They
like
won't last.
they won't last for a long. But
correct.
But the cloud always stay.
Yeah. So we are able to see a cloud as long as it lasts. Right. So after a certain time, the cloud won't last. Right. So it all depends on how much is the entrainment. Okay. And secondly, whether the cloud has enough momentum, impetus to go up. Suppose it is not able to go up after a certain period of time, it doesn't have any positive buoyancy because the buoyancy effect was too less, slowly it will go and slowly it will dissipate.
Okay.
As long as it doesn't, we will see it. So that's why the cloud is a transient phenomena. It will die for various reasons. Either it will fall as rainfall, or it will die by itself also because it cannot go anywhere, or slowly, if it is entraining too much also, it will slowly dissipate. So the time scale that we say of clouds of 1 hour, half an hour, 3-4 hours is as long as it is alive.
Okay. So to us it looks like they are staying as it is in the cloud, like that white cloud we we see. They looks like they are frozen, and they are there. Looks like.
Yeah,
but
it looks
saying,
like because we are just seeing it once like this and going down.
Yeah.
you go in an aircraft, or you even see this clouds over there. Now after 10-15 minutes, you will see the shape has changed.
Okay.
You just look at it. Okay, some clouds. That's all.
Okay. But when the rain happen, it looks like they come from the fragmentation. They start coalescing again. The reverse process start, and then they become a bigger.
And now we are not seeing a single cloud.
Yeah.
When there is a rain, it is not one. It is a mass of clouds.
Yeah.
So what we are studying is a single kind of rising thing that will die. A single in that huge mass of cloud.
Yes.
Many single columns will go up, they will die, another column will come up. So we are in a net, we are seeing a thing. So when we say a cloud, you might see when it's floating, a small offshoot you might see. That offshoot might die very easily. But the overall system might stay longer.
Yeah, Dr. Samrat, can you please hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sir. My name is Shyam Sundar. I'm from BITS Pilani, and it's good to see you after a long time.
Okay, Shyam Sundar.
So my question is, like, can you please, share some details about post-processing with the DNS data? Like, this is a huge data, and then how to generate meaningful information from, DNS will be generating a lot of information.
Yes.
So how do you do that? Can you please comment on that?
So when you say meaningful information, what do we understand by meaningful information? Now, suppose, I want to study only that, small region of the turbulent, non-turbulent interface, where the fluid is very, less, not turbulent here, and slowly when it goes to the inside, it becomes turbulent. Okay, I want to study this. Now it can be argued. You have heard of the Kolmogorov scales. Okay, you have probably done a course on turbulence as well.
Yes, sir.
Right, so you have heard of Kolmogorov scale. It so happens that sometime in many areas, this turbulent, non-turbulent interface, the thickness is the Kolmogorov scale. Okay, or maybe 10 times the Kolmogorov scale.
Yes, sir.
Right. So, if you want to generate meaningful data related to the turbulent, non-turbulent interface itself, you will need to get resolution within the thickness of the turbulent, non-turbulent interface. So that would be meaningful data over there. Okay. Now, if you are saying I want to, what you say, let's say the mass flux that is coming up. Okay. What can you, if I was to ask you how do you generate meaningful data? How, if you could be more specific, then maybe I'll try to answer that.
So I am, asking in the sense that you will have, I think, fluctuations. So fluctuation along X direction, along Y direction, and generally like they plot some correlations and these things. So from somebody who is, let us say, not from turbulence background, not from DNS, and then like, how to understand such data, like when they present, how the data is correlated. So something like that,
Yeah. So after doing this, why do people do DNS? To say that I have got very high level data of all skills that have been possible. Okay. Then what people do to analyze, of course, if you see everywhere, it's all stochastic and all disturbed only. So the only, sometimes people do filtering of data. That is, there is in some structure that is so big that within that, of course, there will be a lot of disturbance. But overall the structure looks coherent. So they do some integral length scales. They do some filtering of data using some, Gaussian filter or various filters, and they do it and try to get a structure that is big enough in size, and they say that that is a coherent structure. Okay. So those are the techniques that people have to do it. After getting that, you have to pass it through some filters and see something bigger that is happening. Otherwise, you will just get a lot of noise, which you will not be able to filter. That's one of the methods that I can think of right away.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so participants, any other question? Any other doubt? I'm sure with the cloud, many doubts might be coming in your head. You are like, please share it, like whatever the mystery you feel like a cloud, what mysterious thing it is. Hello. So I think with this, Dr. Samrat, we are very thankful to you for this.
Sir, one question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, I don't know whether it's a layman question or not. Why clouds are not visible at night?
Why clouds are not visible at night?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So at what do we see in the night? Okay, how do we see? We see whatever our eyes can, detect, right? So our eyes detect, that wavelength spectrum is there, from wavelengths across all kinds of wavelengths, from very small to very high. And our visible light, people say, is between 0.4 micron to 0.7 micron, something is there, visible spectrum. That is, our eyes are sensitive to only radiation of a very small wavelength. Is that okay for you?
Yes.
So in the daytime, see, our sun is, why do we understand, why can we see light? That is because our sun's outer surface temperature, that is at 6,000 Kelvin, approximately 5,500, something like that. The maximum energy comes in that wavelength of 0.4 to 0.7, which our human eyes can see. Okay, so that's why we are able to see. And then that light, when it is passing through a cloud, when that light is passing through a cloud, it will get reflected. So wherever there is no cloud, we are able to see more light from the sun in that visible spectrum. And when it is being absorbed by the cloud or being reflected by the cloud, we are able to see less amount of light. Okay, so that's how we are able to see it. Now, we are not, now you can ask, why are we, the Earth's surface is there. The Earth's surface also emits radiation of a certain wavelength because it emits in the infrared wave spectrum. Because the temperature is lower, it will emit at the higher wavelength, infrared spectrum. You can ask, why don't we see the radiation emitted by the Earth's surface? When we see the Earth's surface, we are seeing the radiation reflected from the Earth's surface. The radiation from the sun comes, hits the Earth's surface and reflects back some amount of it. That we are seeing as the Earth's surface, the reflected part of the radiation. We are not seeing the radiation emitted from the Earth's surface because our eyes are not sensitive to that wavelength. Okay, so in the night time, the clouds or whatever are at a temperature, they are emitting, but they are emitting at a wavelength that our eyes cannot detect. You can see it from an infrared camera. You have an infrared camera, you focus it around, you will be able to see. You put your hand on the wall, okay, the wall will get heated up. You put a hand on the wall will get heated up. Put an infrared camera, you will be able to see the mark of your hand. Does that answer your question?
Okay, sir. It's all about the wavelength.
Yeah.
Okay, so when it comes to cloud, actually the question comes more about the fundamental, like the general realization rather than the more technical, I feel.
And another thing is that, sir, you are modeling or mimicking the cloud in your laboratories. So the cloud exists only at a distance of 10 kilometers from our surface. So can't we do the actual experimentation over there also?
10 kilometers height.
You told that it's at a distance of 10 kilometer height from our surface. So actual experimentation can be done. Like today, if, the government are setting space stations where they are doing experimentation, which is at a more height. Isn't it?
Yes, you can. Of course, people do experiments in space also. People can do there also, certainly. But what experiment will you do at a height of 10 kilometers? You'll take the same small apparatus here and take it over there. What will you do?
Whatever you are doing in your laboratories, just mimicking that cloud, and you are maybe you are learning, you are trying to model what will be the effect of different temperatures, or what will be the effect of different atmospheric whatever changes are taking place on the cloud, and what something about weather forecasting or something else. So I think it could be better than over there. I don't know how much feasible it is. That's
well, feasibility is a question, and you can always say, I want to do something at high up. See, what happens when you do the actual experiment at that high up, it is useful to the extent that at high up you might have a different temperature, you will have a different lapse rate. So that basically the surrounding over there is different. If you specifically ask what extra gain I'm going to get, I do not know, because you can probably you can mimic what is happening right up there. You can mimic at the surface also. It might make a much more cost-effective solution, that you somehow make the temperature in your chamber such that it is similar to what it happens 10 kilometers up. I think that would be a more feasible way. How does NASA decide on those robots or those travelers that are moving on Mars? By creating conditions on the surface of the Earth only. So that is my answer, but specifically if you are asked, I'll have to think about it, how it will become better over there.
Yes, so the thing is that as you told now, we can do a lot of experimentation in our laboratories because it's just a model, and you can play with the different pressures, temperatures, you can model, whereas it's clouds are very big enough, so it won't be, I think, that much visible. But still, it was a question in my mind. Thank you, sir.
Okay, fine.
Kishore sir, unmute yourself. You are not audible.
Yeah, Sajan. So what I think the way you are asking, some experiment is possible. You take the air velocity like some average quantity, but when you are interested to get the details about the vortices, how it exists, how it float, what are the entrainment, like if you are interested in this kind of details of analysis, then if you remember from the first talk, he has explained several way of flow measurement in experimental way. Those will be very difficult because the expanse is quite large, enormous, like kilometers of the size of the clouds, right? So that's why I feel the detailed fluid dynamical, the lab model is important, capture such fluid dynamical details.
And another thing that happens is, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to say that very few results have till now been done on clouds at a high level. People take aircrafts to move to collect data. Of course, those are real-time data, but you do not know that given that aircraft, how much you're disturbing the atmosphere around you. Okay,
Yes,
and secondly, if you want to then go with a balloon to a thunderstorm, I don't know who would want to risk his or her life going in a balloon in a thunderstorm with all kinds of charges roaming around.
So that's actually, you can say, the lab model, the scale model, and the beauty of computational tools which we have, that we can actually create it on our system, and we can, through scale modeling, we can somehow mimic it in our laboratory, right?
Yeah.
So
at the end of the day, it is all about which is the more, economically feasible and simple way of doing it. Of course, there will be certain insights that will come when you go up there. Okay, but it might be so difficult to do it that right now people are not so worried about it. They say that no, I'm going to apply my brain and all my ingenuity in recreating that situation here. And I hope that what happens at the laboratory level is what is happening there.
Right. So I think among our participant, one more participant is quite interested, Tazbi, I guess. So please ask your question.
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. Since we are speaking about clouds, we are taking clouds into picture. Sir, do you have any real-time experience regarding artificial rain or something like that, sir?
Means whether I have actually done it like that?
Yes, sir. Any simulation or any real-time experience related to that?
No, I have not done any simulation with respect to the artificial rain. Basically, see, simulation of artificial rain, again, you will not be able to do it a proper simulation because I have not heard of a direct numerical simulation where you're simulating all scales. Because what happens is that let's say you're adding one particle, okay, then you will have to simulate around that small particle how the fluid is condensing, the phase change and everything around that particle has to be simulated with there are certain collision integrals, how different things collide, how the particles join together. There is a small, this particular code that I'm using has been slightly extended to include moisture, but at the DNS level, I have not heard of something at particle level that has been done for direct numerical simulation that seeks to resolve all scales, that is to capture the smallest relevant scale. And we don't even know that, let us say you're trying to put a particle. See, now important, right?
Yes,
that is what is direct numerical simulation. Now, let us say somehow the particles have, condensed around one droplet, and now two droplets are trying to join together. That could happen at a level much smaller than the viscous scale. I'm not sure how that is going to be resolved. So there also you need to do certain collision integrals and something like that is there.
Okay, okay, sir. Okay.
Okay, so
I don't know how the simulation is done with respect to bigger scales.
okay. Hello. Hello.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Yes, sir.
Of course,
So,
simulation is done. Otherwise, people won't just just go and throw some particles here and there. They will do a simulation in a very rough sense and then do some. That's why this cloud seeding is not always successful.
Understood, sir. Okay.
Okay, participants. So let's thank our guest speaker, Dr. Samrat Rao, for this wonderful talk.
I hope.
And,
Am I not audible?
Yes, yes, we can hear you, sir.
Audible,
We can
sir.
hear. Okay. So I think we'll lose him. So let's move for our new talk. Actually, it has been a bit delayed because we faced some glitches at the beginning. So let's just admit him once. Hello. Hello, sir. Yes.
Yeah, something happened. I
Yeah.
got
Yeah.
locked.
Yes. Yes. So, Dr. Samrat Rao, very thankful for this wonderful talk. Actually, at the end, as we expected, our participants got very excited about the field and come up with very the doubts which they have in the mind regarding the field. So,
Yeah, sometimes answering basic questions is difficult. So thanks a lot for this, opportunity.
Okay. Okay. So I
Sir,
hope our
Thank you, Samrat sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Sham.
Okay, so thank you very much, sir. I hope our participant would have learned a lot from this talk. Thank you very much.